let's go. So I wanted to try to give a bit of an idea of what I'm doing on systems of interacting particles. So of course, this is going to be a talk for a large audience. So I apologize for those of you who saw the actual technical talk. You're not going to learn a lot. But now, on the other hand, I thought a lot, I mean, how simple or not so simple I should do this. In the end, I thought that most of you at least should not be too scared if I use a few math symbols once in a while. So there will be some equations in the talk. But I tried to keep the technical level I mean, as reasonable as I could. Although if it goes well, at the very end, I might do something a bit more complicated. And otherwise, I'll just keep it. So the first thing that I want to go into is when we're talking about, many particle or multi-agent systems, many people automatically have an idea of what is meant. If you're saying particles, then you're thinking physics, and you're thinking very small, tiny objects. So you're thinking ions or electrons, for instance. And this is one application. It's actually one of the first, and that's plasmas. Now that has been a very popular topic for quite some time because of a variety of applications, from nuclear fusion to, well, the plasmas that used to be in our TV 10 years ago. But even if I stay within physics, right, there's the other extreme of particles. And those are not things that you would normally call particles, but that's how they are used. And then the second example, I'm going to go to astrophysics. And what actually people do is they calculate the evolution of the universe using this type of models, at least at some large scales where the universe is mostly flat. And in that case, one particle can actually be a whole galaxy, or sometimes even a galaxy cluster. So now we are talking about something that is extremely large, of course, but is seen at an even larger scale. And those are the very classical type of applications in physics, but there's another one that I'll actually try to show to you some of the models on this one, which concerns fluids, and something that is called a point vortex in a fluid. And I'll show you a picture. We'll explain a little bit what it is. And this is not something that actually exists, if you want. This is a representation of some of the phenomena that happens in a fluid. But it's not something that I can touch and that I can say, there you have matter, and this is the particle that we are looking at. So even at the level of physics, when we are discussing this sort of things, well, sometimes we are talking about particles, again, there's no actual object that corresponds to the particle. But it's been now quite a bit of time when this kind of system just branched out of only physics, and you find it in many, many places. I didn't want to do a whole half of a talk describing all the various possibilities, so I'll just mention a few. Of course, the closest to physics is now go to biophysics or biomechanics. And another example of many particle systems are when you try to follow aerosols that you can breathe, so medical aerosols. And those are composed of typically a gas and then tiny droplets of liquid And this liquid is actually the medicine that you're interested in. Now the game becomes try to follow those droplets and see where they go. And this is very, very important because depending on what you're trying to treat, you either wanted to go in the upper respiratory tract, so in the throat, or very much down into the lungs. And the people who are manufacturing these aerosols are very much aware of that, and they try to adjust the size of the droplets and other physical properties so that most of it will go at the right location. Another examples are, of course, various suspensions in the blood or in other biofluids. Going, again, one step further away from the actual physics, you now have a lot about collective behavior of animals. And you may have heard of words like swarming or flocking. So flocking typically applies to birds, and try to understand how birds can maintain a very precise specific formation. But you have this kind of collective behavior in a lot of animal populations. And I mentioned large animals so far, but this is actually even more important for very small things such as microorganisms. And I'll go over chemotaxis. This is the second example that I'll try to go a little bit more in depth about later on. And chemotaxis is just the dynamics of microorganism as driven by chemicals. And this has proved very important if, in studying how tumor grow, for instance, in cancer. But if I go very, very small, then I also have neural networks. So the neurons in your brain, how they are organized, how they react, this is very often the basic model is, again, a many particle system. We've talked about animals. Of course, we can try to use those models for human beings. And again, in social sciences, now you find a lot of multi-agent systems that try to represent how opinions or ideas propagate in the population. And you find the same type of system in economics, sometimes coupled with some sort of controls, and then you end up in something that is called mean field games that I will really not talk about today. But that is, of course, very, very interesting. All right, so to lighten this up, these are two examples of the first one is the numerical simulations using this kind of system. And I have to say here something good about the CNRS, which is not often, but something great that they are doing is they have a fantastic repository of images of experiments, whether actual experiments or numeral experiments as here. And I really, I mean, you should go and have a look because this is just fantastic. So what this is a dynamics of galaxies. So the color here represents the density of galaxy. Red is very dense. Dark blue is very low density. The yellow that you see there, right, is not a density. It gives you the direction of the galaxy at this point. And this is a relatively simple simulation trying to understand how you can form large-scale structure by having, galaxies that tend to concentrate around some central structure, which is the red that you see there. I will write down the system that is actually solved here a little bit later, and it fits perfectly within the classical, what we call the classical many-particle system. This is actually Newton's dynamics. And the other side, right, so the other side in terms of scale and the other side in terms of field are neurons. And this is a reconstruction of part of the brain of the rat. the hippocampus. Now, what they're doing here is that they are marking the cytoskeleton, the proteins on the cytoskeleton. So this shows relatively well the boundaries of the neuron cells. And what you see in the center here, right, is the main part of the neurons. And then you have the axons and the dendrites that connect it to other neurons. Now, let's talk numbers. And there's one slide that you get out of the whole talk. It should be this one. This is also the one slide that I put in every single of my talk on the topic, whether it's for a general audience or whether it's for more specialized audiences, such as colleagues in math or physics, because it's very, very critical. This is the whole reason why there is something to discuss. And the question is, how many particles or agents am I talking about in those models? And the order of magnitude here is very, very important. So let me call capital N the number of particles or the number of agents. And let's go again, starting from physics and going down, and I don't mean any, it's just going down from my slides, right? I don't mean that physics is above other disciplines or anything like this. So how many particles are we talking in this simulation, for instance? Right? How many galaxies do I put? Well, typically in the numerical simulations like that, you will have around 10 to the 10, 10 to the 12. Sometimes it goes to 10 to the 14. So 10 to the 12 is 10 billion. But if you really go to large scales, what people say is that what you should simulate is maybe 10 to the 20, 10 to the 25. And sometimes astrophysicists try to simulate dark matter, right? So the evolution of dark matter. And some crazy model, of course, no one has observed dark matter so far. We only see its effect. So it's very much a question what it is, and therefore how many particles of it there is. In some rather extreme prediction, go as far as 10 to the 60 particles of dark matter in our universe. So those are huge numbers. And you keep this kind of huge numbers in a lot of physical problems. I mentioned plasmas. How many ions do we have in the plasma? Well, you should think something of the order of the Avogadro number. So again, we are going to be to 10 to the 20, 10 to the 25 particles. We cannot do numerical simulations with that many. The best I have seen use something like 10 to the 14, and this is already weeks of simulation on some of the best computers we have. So typically what people will do for numerical purposes is 10 to the 9, 10 to the 12. And that also fits relatively well with the kind of number that you have if you're studying microorganisms. So if we're studying a population of bacteria, how many bacteria are we actually talking about? If you have an infection, for instance, in your blood, if there are a lot less than 1 million, you will probably not be able to detect it. If you go above 10 to the 12, you're probably dead. So that, again, gives us a very rough range of the order of magnitude that we're talking in cases like that. But those are not the only examples I mentioned. If I'm doing, collective behavior, collective dynamics, so I'm talking about birds, I'm talking about fish, right? There's no way that I have a flock of 1 million birds. That's not realistic. And when people are doing social sciences or economy, very often what they consider are, populations of the order of a few thousands, sometimes a few tens of thousands. I actually have now a group of students that is looking at how, trying to look at how extremist ideas are propagating on Reddit. And the number of people who post that in the forums that they are interested in is again of the order of 50,000. So we're not talking billions, right? We're not talking billions of billions there. We're talking about very smaller numbers. This is still large. And as I will show you, the question of what is the behavior of a math system where you have 50,000 equations in it, it's already very, very complex. But when we are going to discuss this, and when we are going to discuss what happens when n is large, it is absolutely crucial to be aware of the huge variation we have in those numbers. Because what I can deduct for an n that is 10 to the 60 has to be vastly different to what I can deduct for an n that is 10 to the 3. And so I'm a mathematician, and very often in math, when someone tells you, well, there's a number that is very, very large, then the reflex is to say, I'm going to take the limit, number goes to infinity. And mathematically, that makes a lot of things more simple. So there is a very big temptation here. As much as we can, we should resist it, and we should try instead to give quantitative results, meaning we should try to quantify how things behave in terms of n. So let me try to explain a little bit what those models look like with some math formula. So here things are a tiny bit more technical. So let's spend some time on this slide as well. What's the most basic model that I can think of? I'm going to consider, again, capital N particles or agent, and I'm going to assume that they are identical. Identical means that they have exactly the same properties. So if we're talking about the plasma, for instance, then this is easy to understand, right? I have ions on the plasma, and all the ions are the same. That doesn't mean they occupy the same position. That doesn't mean they have the same velocity, but they are all the same. If we're talking about a social science model, then I have agents. And what we are going to assume here for simplicity is that all of the agents react in the same manner. Again, they may not have the same starting condition. They may not see the same environment. So their evolution is not going to be the same. Otherwise, there wouldn't be anything interesting to say. The only thing we're saying is if they were in the same environment with the same conditions, then they would react in the same way. And that's what is meant by identity. And the next big assumption that I'm doing is that they are interacting 2 by 2. And I'll say a lot more when we start looking at this expression right in the middle about what I mean by 2 by 2. All right, so let's say now that you want to track what those things are doing. The first step that you have to perform is you have to decide which property of the agent you want to track. There can be a lot of things here. If you're interested in their position, you're going to track their position, obviously. So if I want to do flocking of birds, then I have to know where the birds are. But that's probably not the only thing I want to track then. I probably want to track how fast they are flying and in which direction. So I want to add their velocity. maybe again, this is not enough. If I'm thinking of opinion dynamics, I may not be very concerned with where physically, the physical location of people. But it might be more important to track their opinion. How you model opinion would be worth a talk on its own. So let's not go there and let's remain vague. But let's say you found a convincing way to assign a number to various opinions. And then you want to track this. So in general, what I'm going to do is to each particle or agent, so let's give them numbers, right? Number them from 1 to n. And to particle with number I, I'm going to assign some vector xi. And that vector is a list of all the things that I need to know about it. And let's call it xi. And this is something that will change according to time. So now the way I represent my system is by this list of vectors, x1 of t, x2 of t, etc., till xn of t. What I have to model is how the time evolution of the xi goes. And this is what this equation is doing. So here I'm assuming that you know what a derivative is. And if not, I'm in trouble. So the model tells you what is the time derivative of each xi. So it gives you what is the infinitesimal amount of change in the xi at each time. And it tells you that this is a sum of various contributions. The first term is something that is purely internal to the agent. So we're talking about a bacteria, for instance, that decides on its own that it wants to change direction and go somewhere else, without any influence from the other bacteria in the system. Sometimes this does not exist, so you can just take it equal to 0, and sometimes you have to take this sort of what is called self-interaction because you interact with yourself. All the rest here are the interactions from one agent to another. And so this first term is the interaction of agent 1 on agent I. And I'm just saying, you know, this interaction only depends on the difference between the two vectors. And then there's a function, right? Some sort of, we often call that a kernel, k, that will tell you, depending on the difference between the two states of the agent, what is the effect of agent 1 on agent I. And here you see a little bit what I meant by interacting 2 by 2. Because what I'm doing is I'm just looking at the individual effects of each of the other agents, and I'm summing them. So the contribution to the changes in the state of agent I from all the other agents can be decomposed in a sum of individual contributions. It's very simple. And it's not always true. But it's the most simple thing you can do. This still leaves a lot of unanswered question, which is, okay, so now how do I choose the function f and how do I choose this function k? But this is also, if I want to simulate this system, well, I need to decide on the starting point. So let's agree that the starting point is time 0. But then how do I decide how to start? Then I have to give me an initial distribution of those xi at time 0. And I will go over that a bit later. This is another important point. Before going into this, let me show you the canonical example of all of this. And this is what we now call the Newton dynamics of point masses. This is certainly the first many particle system that ever was written, because it was actually derived by Newton. Newton didn't write it like that. Newton didn't have a good notion of derivative at the time, and he didn't have our algebra, so he would not have understood what I've written here. But this is his laws. And it's probably also among the first example of differential equations that we had. Now, what Newton told you is that if you study the dynamics and the dynamics of celestial objects, for instance, well, you need to know their position and you need to know their velocity. So now my state vector xi, you see, is composed of two things. The position, qi, which in general is a point in dimension 3, and the velocity vi, which is, again, a vector in dimension 3. And I have to tell you how those evolve. What Newton tells you is that the changes in position is the velocity. And the changes in velocity is the acceleration. And then I have to use the gravitational law. And the gravitational law tells you that the interaction acting on particle I is the sum of all the gravitational force coming from the other particles. The gravitational force behaves in 1 over the distance to the square, and it's according to the direction between them, so you get this actual formula. And then there's a physical coefficient in front of all this. And this physical coefficient is the gravitational constant times the mass of a particle that you feel the interaction from, times the mass of a particle on which the gravitation is felt, divided by its mass, because we have to use the acceleration. So it's this expression. And this is actually still used. If you're thinking, well, Newton's dynamics, since general relativity, that is not appropriate to study the universe. It actually is at the appropriate scales, because then again, the universe is essentially flat. At other scales, you need to use relativity, of course. Now, let's talk a little bit about noise. The previous model I've shown you are entirely deterministic. If you know the initial position, you've decided on the model, then you can predict the result. Well, provided you have a computer that is powerful enough to do the calculations, but if you have it, you can predict the result with as good an accuracy as, again, your computer will allow. And in many cases, you don't think that it's the right way to go. And what people do then is they add noise. And there are various reasons why you might want to add noise. The first reason, if I'm staying with my Newton's dynamics, are random collisions. And what happens, for instance, is that you don't only have planets and things like that in the universe, you also have interstellar gas. And that can change a little bit of the direction of your objects. But this kind of random environment is actually very, very common. If I'm going to study aerosols, for instance, so again, tiny droplets in the air, well, I have to take into account Brownian motion. So things like that are a good reason to put noise. But there are other reasons. You might want to represent complex behavior of agents. And a big example, if I'm thinking of bacteria, is bacteria have a dynamics which is often called tumble and run. which means that they tend to go in a given direction, and then from time to time, they tumble around and they pick another direction. Now, how they change direction, how they decide on the new direction, this is probably a rather complicated phenomenon. It is, of course, due to all the biochemical reactions that go inside the bacteria. Bacteria is only a very complex object. So at the level when you want to simulate, a few billion bacteria, you probably don't feel like having a very good representation of what's going inside every one of them. And instead, it appears very reasonable to say, look, this is just random. And this is my last point. Very, very often we put randomness because we are not actually very sure of our models. And we're saying, let's add a bit of noise, and that represents the uncertainty that we have. In the simplest case, I'm taking here the exact same previous model. And what I'm doing is that I'm just adding a noise. So I'm adding this DWI term. Now, you see differences, right? Why don't I have dxi over dt anymore? Why is the dt there? What does dwi mean? And those can be a little bit painful to explain. There's a whole theory in math of stochastic differential equations that was developed after World War II to actually give a precise meaning to that, and there is no way that I'm going to do this. The only thing I want to say here is Wi corresponds to Brownian motion. And what we're doing here is we are putting independent noise on each particle. So we're saying that the randomness that happens on one particle does not depend on the randomness that happens on the other particle. And I really don't want to go further than that. Except to say that sometimes the randomness is what we call degenerate, so it does not apply to the whole state vector. And again, if I keep talking about the Newton's dynamic as an example, then here's my Newton's dynamics, and you see that I didn't put any randomness in the evolution of the position. Because the random collisions, what they're doing is they change the velocity, but they don't change the position directly. So this is a case where, again, the noise is called degenerate because it only applies to parts of the system. Now, there's a last question in this super long introduction, which is how the model scales. And this is actually another delicate question. In general, what happens is I will start with some model, and I will have constants in it, physical constants or other type of constants. And I will have an initial distribution. And then, okay, let's rescale the initial distribution so that everyone is of order 1 initially. That's simpler, right? And maybe I want to rescale time according to the time scale that I want to see. And this leads with various constants in the model, right? And if I'm going there, you see that the two constants that I've shown are at least alpha and sigma. And a very key thing is how those constants will behave, one with respect to another, and how they will behave with respect to n. And you have a whole zoology of model based on that. So the only choice of how they interact is not enough. You also have this scaling that is absolutely important. And let me give you, again, a very, very rough idea of what's going on here. Let's look at the interaction term, right, which is this sum of 2 by 2 interactions. And it comes with an alpha. Now, I have n particles, so I have n terms in that sum. And n is large. That's the whole point in my talk. But alpha could be small. Now, there is a very obvious case here where things might go well, which is if alpha turns out to be exactly of the order of 1 over n. Because then I have an average of n terms, and I can expect that this interaction is again going to be of order 1. Now, that can be true, and in some cases it won't. Again, that depends on how you start, how many particles you're looking at, how confined they are or how not confined, and this is by far not the only possibility. But this is called the mean field scaling, and it's the one I will consider here. And what I often like to say is this is the simplest and interesting scaling for the problem. It's interesting because the interaction does not vanish. You see that if alpha was much smaller than 1 over n, then this would be very, very small. And I wouldn't have a very interesting system because if particles don't interact with each other, then I should just consider each one of them independently. Of course, if alpha is not small enough, then this is a very, very large term. And what is going to happen is much more complicated. Right. So in the end, this is what I want to discuss. I have the average, I have the noise. This is the mean field scaling for many particle systems. This is what the equation looks like. Sometimes I will use this sigma, capital sigma symbol, which represents the sum and which is a little bit easier to track down mathematically speaking. And now I have to talk about what is called the mean field limit. But before going that, I want to go back to the question of how we should choose the initial distribution of state vector. And there is a first observation here, which is there's no way we can measure this in most cases. Again, if I'm thinking plasma as a typical physical example, well, if you want to measure that, you would have to measure the position and velocities of something like 10 to the 25 particles at the same time. That is not going to happen. And I'm not even considering quantum effects or anything like this here. This is simply not going to happen. So what do we do? Well, another important observation is that if you're doing an experiment, then the initial configuration is actually the result of another dynamics. And it's the dynamics that led to whatever point when you started your experiment. So it depends how you're going to prepare it, of course. But typically what people do is they wait till something has reached some sort of equilibrium, and then they perturb it in some way. That's the typical experiment. And this has led to a very natural assumption, which is that the initial distribution is somewhat random. And traditionally associated to this, you observe that I'm talking about plasmas, there's a reason, is the assumption of molecular chaos. Now, this is not the chaos of dynamical system that people are thinking since the 70s. This is the molecular chaos of the 19th century. And what molecular chaos says is that when there are that many particles, then typically one should expect that their positions and velocities are independent and identically distributed. So the position on one does not depend on the position on the other. And the position of each is going to be random, and it's going to be distributed randomly according to some law, and that law is supposed to be the same for everyone. This is often abbreviated in chaos, and that has remained a very big assumption in that field. Now, you're going to tell me, though, well, if I'm studying neural networks, I'm not so sure about molecular chaos, right? I'm not so sure that the state of the neurons in your brain are actually distributed initially according to something like that. And you're most probably right. And then we should do something else. Again, during this talk, I'm sticking to the simplest possible framework, so I will stick to that as an initial condition. But this is not always true. So what is about this mean field that I'm talking about? The point about this mean field is, again, sorry, there are dots missing here in the middle. Looking about this sum of terms, right? And now everything is random here. And what I want to say is that this interaction, I want to replace it by expected value. So I want to take some of the randomness out of the system by taking, instead of seeing the exact field, what the particles see is the mean field. And that's where the name mean field limit, mean field scaling comes from. And if I do that, instead of my initial system, I have now something that mathematicians like to call now the Makin-Vlasov process, which reads like that, and where what I've done is I've replaced this term by its average. Okay, what's the justification for this? Well, the sort of justification is that this looks like a law of large number. And that would be okay if the randomness in the xi was independent. So that's what I assumed initially. Now, if all those points are independent, then here, yeah, I have a law of large number. And what I'm saying is I have an average of independent quantity. This is very close to its mean. The big problem is this cannot be true. I can choose to have independence at some time, at the initial time here, but that's not going to remain the case later on. And that's because there are correlations between the agents and between the particles that come from the bindings. And there is no way that I can avoid that. And so the big recurring notion for those systems that show up is what is called propagation of chaos, which is to say that if you start from something that is independent, then at a later time, well, they will not be exactly independent, but they will be almost independent, which will allow to justify this kind of approximation. This is super vague, right? What do you mean by almost independent? Well, that's the whole point. That's the whole point of those studies is, can we quantify what we mean by almost independent? And then can we compare the approximation that we've made here? So can I tell you that this system, how much of a good approximation this Makin-Vlasov system is to the initial system? Right? So that's my work. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm interested in. And let me tell you why this is important. So let's assume that we have justified this system, right, which again has plenty of math symbols in it now. And I start with chaos. So the xi bar, right, because this is the approximate system, the xi bar 0 are indeed independent and identically distributed. then it turns out that for this system, it remains the case. And if they are all independent, and again, I forgot to put the dots here because I just copy-paste. If they are all independent and identically distributed, well, I can forget about all of them, almost. And instead of solving a system here with 10 to the 25 equations, I only need to solve 2. Actually, even 1, but let's say 2 as it's simpler to explain. Because the expectation of xi minus x1 is going to be the exact same as the expectation of xi minus xn, and it's going to be the exact same as the expectation of xi minus any other x that is not I. So I can just remove all of them, and I just need to solve 2 equations. But I need to calculate expectations. So I need to solve those 2 equations with enough initial data that I can have a good representation of the law. So I need enough realizations. That's the trade-off. You exchange a super large system for a much reduced one, but one that now you have to solve for many realizations. If the initial law is reasonable, and if we can sample it in a good manner, then that's a very good trade-off. And I'm just mentioning, now this uses too many math symbols that I don't want to explain, but there is actually also a way to solve what is called a partial differential equations out of this. And it's called the Makin-Blasov equation, directly on the law of the system. But I really don't want to explain what's going on there. All right. Now let me give you 2 other examples of multi-agent or many particle system that are very complicated to resolve mathematically, and those turns out to be my big contribution the past couple of years. So the first one is again physics, but comes back to this notion of vorticity in a fluid. And I like this experiment a lot because it's so hard to get something that is as clean as that. So let me spend 2 minutes on this. What do we see here? This is a soap film. Now, soap film have 2 big advantages when you're going to do experiments like that. The first one is they give you a 2-dimensional flow because it's a film. So it's relatively naturally 2-dimensional, which is often complicated to actually do good 2-dimensional flow. The second big advantage is it's very, very easy to see the velocity on the fluid because of all the nice colors that you have on soap. So what do we see here? You see those things here? Right? They're sort of like sub-regions in the soap that are one next to the other, and then there's some sort of interactions. This is what we call a vortex. And what a vortex does is it's a region where the velocity of the fluid turns around. And it turns around faster and faster when you're getting closer to the center of the vortex. So those are our particles, actually, the center of those vortices. Those are the particles that I want to track here. And you see that you have many of them, and you see that, right, I mean, if you're close enough to the center, it's relatively clear what's going on, but then the further away, it's not so clear, right? And then you have squeeze vortices like this one. And then you have big regions here where there doesn't seem to be any vortex, but something is going on. This is the system. There's actually a law that tells you how is the velocity created by a point vortex in a fluid, in a 2D incompressible fluid. And it's this expression where the perpendicular here just denotes the vector rotated by pi over 2 or 90-degree angle. So in a vortex centered at xi, what this does is this does a velocity that turns around and that is larger and larger as you go closer to the center, because you see that here I have an exponent 2. So when x is getting closer to xj, this is going up. And what is the multi-agent system that I have? Well, we simply assume that the center of each of its point vortices evolve according to the total velocity of the fluid. And how do we compute the total velocity of the fluid? We just add all the contributions of each point vortex. And then you get formulas like this with very explicit expression. Now, you observe here that I removed the self-contribution. And I have to do something because, as I said, this is singular, right? In the sense that if I take x equal to xj, the expression is not well defined. So I have to make a decision. And the decision is no self-interaction. There are good physical reasons for that. And again, I'm just going to completely pass over that. But this singularity is the key problem mathematically here if we want to do anything with this. Let me skip this slide. This is just to say, let me just say the first paragraph here. This is actually a system that dates back from the mid-19th century. And the conjecture since that time is that as I'm adding more and more point vortices, the limit of this dynamics will go to a continuum fluid that is the standard 2D incompressible Navier-Stokes. This is the conjecture that we solved recently, only recently. And let me bypass the rest. The next example I want to talk about is this chemotaxis problem. So the dynamics of cell under chemotaxis. And this is, again, an actual experiment. It's not so easy to see what cells are doing. You see here that we have concentrations. So they do tend to gather together. And that's another big issue. I'm getting close to the end of my time. So let me just, again, very, very roughly explain what the model is like here. We're going to consider a certain number of microorganisms and one chemical for simplicity. And what I want to say is that the microorganisms are trying to go to the region with a higher concentration of the chemical. And what I'm going to calculate then is what is known as the gradient of the concentration. The gradient of concentration just gives you the direction where the concentration increases. And what I choose as a model is something very simple. I'm saying that the position of a cell is going to move, and it's going to move in the direction of this gradient. So it's going to move in the direction where the concentration increases. And that's this first term here. And I'm adding noise because if you're looking at cells, they are very noisy. Now the question is, how do I calculate the concentration? And it's a chemical. And to make the system interesting, what we assume is that the microorganisms themselves also produce the chemical. So there might be some in the environment and they produce it themselves. And it turns out that, again, if we're flat, so if we're on a Petri dish, for instance, which is the case of the previous experiment, then to calculate the concentration, we only have to solve the diffusion equation And if, moreover, I'm assuming that the chemicals diffuses faster than the cells are moving, then I have a very simple explicit expression, which is given by this. And again, you see this sum of a contribution of everybody. So again, we have this very simple basic structure where the C is what's going on there, right? The C is just the sum of 2x2 interactions. And I don't want to talk so much about this. There's a big problem here, which is that the dynamics is obviously self-reinforcing. That's because the microorganisms produce the chemical themselves. So what happens is the more of them you put in a region, well, the higher the concentration because they produce it. But the higher the concentration, the more you want to attract other microorganisms to the region. And then you might wonder, well, what's going on here? And what's going on here is it can happen that you find everyone at the same point. Right? If I put enough of them in one place, then the others will keep coming. It will make the region even more and more attractive, so everyone will end up coming in the end. And you have a concentration of everybody at one point, which is what in math we call a blow-up. And the language is relatively obvious, right? Because the concentration of microorganism is blowing up at that point. And this can be very difficult in general to understand, but because I've chosen a very simple example, it turns out that here we have a complete answer. And actually, the question of whether there is blow-up or no blow-up entirely depends on how strong the interaction is with respect to the noise. If the interaction is too strong, there's always a blow-up, and there are always concentrations. If the interaction is not too strong, then you never have concentrations. But still, because, again, we have a very, very complex type of behavior, very singular type of behavior, I should say, studying the system is not easy. Is not easy at all. And I'm at the end of my time, so I will stop here and bypass the technical questions. I want just to say a few things about the methods we developed as a conclusion. We have to use the right physics. So it's not only about math calculations, it's really understanding what are the right properties of a system and base the method on that. And what we are doing is to give a statistical control on such large systems with a large range of interactions that can be repulsive, attractive, and that are singular. And everything is explicit. But that doesn't answer all the questions, and in particular, if you start to go away from the very basic structure that I've showed you today, then there are a lot of questions that I cannot answer. And let me stop here. I hope that was not too painful, that you get